Hello, everyone. Welcome to week one of the April STC Roundtable. Today's webinar, Content Strategy Leads, Efficient Content Ops Follows, is presented by Rahel Bailie. Rahel, I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to be talking as, sorry, your name just went out the window, Claudia said. I'm going to be talking about content strategy and content ops, and particularly how it fits into the technical communication landscape. So my name is Rahel Bailie, and I'm working out of London, and I've been in techcomm for many, many years. As you can see, I'm a fellow of the STC, so that means at least 25 years have been in the business. And I come from a techcomm background, although I moved into kind of more pure play web projects, but I understand both sides of the coin. So it's interesting for me because I've watched the progression of the profession, and it's interesting. So we'll explore a little bit of that as we go. So first of all, what is content strategy? I still hear people saying there are a lot of definitions of content strategy. Well, next year, content strategy celebrates its 20th year. It started around the year 2000, and so it's 20 years old. And by now we have a good definition of it. So what is content strategy? Well, there are two words to this, two parts. There's content and there's strategy. So content is human usable contextualized data. It's also semantically tagged copy. I should probably say copy instead of content, but I don't think that copy becomes content until it has the metadata on it. And content is also potential information. So content itself may not tell you a lot, but when you combine two pieces of content, you get exponential amounts of meaning out of it. And then there's strategy, and strategy just means a plan. It's you look at some alternatives, you want to make something happen, so you come up with a few alternatives, and then you choose the best alternative. So you put those together and you get content strategy. So it's a plan for content. That is what people use to understand the world. So if I was to look at this definition from a practitioner's point of view, I would say that it means we're creating a repeatable system that governs the management of content throughout the entire life cycle. And if we parse that, it seems like a very simple statement, but if you parse it, it's repeatable. And what repeatable means is that it's not ad hoc. It means that you looked at different options and you chose one that you can repeat. It's a system. So that means you've got a set of principles that you've organized into some sort of operational model. It's governing, which means that you can't just come along and change it on a whim. There's some established control and authority over the system. And it's about the management of content. So we're not managing financial assets, we're managing content assets. So it's a process of controlling how that content's managed and throughout the entire life cycle. So if we think about content goes through a life cycle, it's not a supply chain, it's a life cycle, then the system has to take all of the stages into consideration. And if we look at the life cycle, the content life cycle, and you may have seen this before because I've published it in a number of places, we can kind of break it down into 4 quadrants. So we're analyzing, like, what are we doing? Why are we writing this content? And it might be very obvious, we have to document this product, or it could be not so obvious. And you can say, well, we really should have an app for this product because more people are going to use it on mobile, or, whatever your rationale is. But you have to think about it. You have to think about the requirements and the personas and scenarios. You have to think about how you're going to govern the content, who's going to sign it off, how are you going to review it, et cetera, et cetera. You think about the budget that you have, and then you kind of go, all right, now you go into the collect mode. Where are we going to get the content from? Where are we going to write it? Are we going to get some of it from a different department or a different company? Are we going to actually write it, or are we going to be editing what subject matter experts give us? What happens if we need to translate it? That's also getting content, it's just in another language. We put metadata on it. So all of these are ways that we collect content together. Then it's about the management of it. So, we have content typing or content modeling. If you're using DITA, for example, you've got the content types right there. But for a lot of other projects, you don't have content types, so you have to create them. You have to configure it. You have to figure out what kind of a repository it's going to go into. You have to figure out which standards you're going to use. And then you have to think about publishing. So when you think about publishing standards, it's like, how do we pull content together? How do we transform it? How do we present it? Is it going into a PDF? Is it going onto a website? Does it need to be broken down? Does it go into maybe other systems or into an interface? So we have to think about all those things. And then how are we going to syndicate the content to kind of move it around underneath the hood into different areas that it needs to be in? And then what happens after we publish it? How do we revise it? How do we sunset it? So all these are questions that we ask even before we get going. We ask all these questions, and that's the basis to a content strategy. Once you've figured out all those pieces, you've pretty well gotten your strategy. So we're managing the content lifecycle. Now, content strategy, excuse me, isn't defined by a subset of content. So you'll hear people say, I'm doing content marketing, so it's a content strategy. It's a content marketing strategy, and it's a subset of the bigger content strategy. So if I think about content strategy, it's designing a content system. And if you think about it, you've got lots of subsystems that you could have, which are very important, but they're not the whole thing. So we know that for example, in technical communication, you might have product content, but you also have support content that has a strong overlap. You might have social media content, because when someone calls and complains or goes to Twitter and complains about the product, you might send them to a link in the knowledge base. So all of these things have to hook up, because how can you have a successful social media strategy where you're trying to support a product if you don't have a knowledge base to send them to, or you don't have support material to send them to, or you don't have training material to send them to? So when you think about how all of these things work together, the content strategy has to consider the whole thing. Now, you might not be responsible for the whole thing, but you still have to consider, how will these things work together? So we think about the bigger picture, and then we kind of narrow it down. So how does content strategy apply in different environments? If you're talking to someone on the marketing side, they're going to talk about the ROI of content. So, treating content as a business asset, they're going to say, we need to build more brand loyalty, we need to get more engagement, better user experience, or we need to help increase revenue using our content, so we need to optimize the quality and we need to deliver personalized content. You're going to hear a lot of that kind of discussion. And this is all about return on investment. So we spend money to make money. So what are some of the ways? Well, we might want to go into new markets. So we want to expand our scope. So whether it's a new market or a new language or new products or a product line, those are all things that they want to do, and they can't do it without more content. So that becomes part of the strategy. They might also want to manage risk, and this comes in handy when it's things like insurance companies, pharmaceuticals, anything, health and safety, and airlines, and not airlines, aircraft manufacturers, and so on. So they want to make sure that their content is very accurate and that it's got a lot of integrity, and they want to comply with regulatory, because you'll hear people talk about, oh, regulatory has to see this, or compliance has to see this. And it's all about if they find a problem with our documentation, we could get fined, or we could get shut down, or whatever it might be. So they want to manage the risk on that. And that's from kind of the more And let's say the business side, or the marketing side of the house, that you'll hear this language being used. But then there's the kind of the back end that we hear about, and that's on the internal rate of return side. So that's where I spend money to save money. So in this case, we want to do things like make our operations more efficient. So we want to be able to produce way more content without adding a whole bunch of people. So we want to work smarter and not harder. We need to add new variants, like new languages. Maybe we want also to diversify into new channels. So you want to do something around, an omni-channel environment where we want to personalize the content, but without having to copy and paste all over the place. Or maybe we have some increased complexity, like now we have to support a bot, and maybe we have to support a chat bot and a voice interface. And, those are things that we're adding on to respond to emerging technologies. And we want to optimize content quality. So it could be about findability, it could be about accessibility, it could be about measuring effectiveness so that we can improve the content in that kind of continuous improvement cycle. So those are kind of the things you'll hear more on the techcomm side. So we have these two sides, and the question becomes, do we need to marry these two sides? Can we leave them in their different silos? But first, we want to talk about why you would want to apply a content strategy to your techcomm environment. So what is the purpose of a strategy? You don't do a strategy just for the sake of a strategy. You do a strategy because you want to turn this into content operations. So you have a strategy, you implement the strategy, and then you operationalize it. And I can't tell you how many times I've done a strategy for a company and they go, thank you very much, and they put it in a drawer and they don't act on it. And then 2 years later, I'll get an email out of the blue saying, by the way, do you still have a copy of that strategy that you did for us? Because I think we're ready to work on it now, but that person left and we can't find the document. So you know that if people just take a strategy and put it into a drawer, it doesn't give them a benefit. So how do you give them a benefit? You operationalize. So if I use a metaphor of a house, then creating a strategy is like designing a house. It's like the architecture, planning out the house. When I implement, it's like building the house. And then when I'm operationalizing, it's like living in the house. And this is why I drew the arrows, the chevrons at different sizes, because your strategy might take a short time to create, and it might take a slightly longer time to implement, but then you use it for multiple years. And so the benefit that you get out of spending a few months developing a strategy and a few more months out of implementing it means that you get lots and lots of savings, whether that be time savings or resource savings or just saving your sanity, because you're not managing content with 50 spreadsheets anymore. Now it's all being done in a system, and I trust me, I've seen those situations. So maybe that's the benefit that you get out of it, but you'll get that benefit for years, kind of consistently once it's implemented. So if you think about it, your strategy has to consider business drivers, because if you look at the right-hand side of this graphic, it all comes down to profitability. So there are two ways to get profitable. Either you increase your revenue, so return on investment, or you increase your operational efficiencies, which is IRR, or you likely do a combination of both. And really the focus of a lot of organizations is to get customers. So it's acquisition. And they think about the ROI, they don't think about the IRR, and they don't think about retention. And a lot of techcomm isn't about getting customers, although there is, increasingly, there's that recognition that we have that ability to provide pre-sales content, that where people will do some sort of a validation by looking at the documentation that you have and making a decision about your product. So there is that. But if you talk about marketing, they will often talk about customer acquisition, but they don't talk about the retention part. And we're often about the retention. So once you do buy the product, then what happens? Do you have really good documentation, or do you have to go to a forum and dig around for hours and hours on end to find anything useful? So these, if you work your way backwards, we've got 5 kind of general areas. Now, I have this general area in terms of what I think the business drivers are, but you can come up with your own, you can come up with more. You don't have to use all of these, but this is just kind of a general framework of working your way backwards to all of the business drivers. So there's kind of the perceived value of content. Is the content really valuable for this product or in this situation? The user experience of the content, the ease of use, the production intensity, and relative production costs. And then if you back that out, what goes into perceived value of content? Well, it's, does it contribute to the profitability? Does it differentiate you from your competitors? So you buy a big fancy machine and your competitors have some really Mickey Mouse pamphlet that goes with it, but you have a good set of instructions. That makes a difference. The perceived value is that yours is better. And then the cost impact. So you can go through all of these and look at these business drivers that feed down into profitability. But really, if you're talking executive language in your strategy, this is what you're thinking about. You're thinking about, how does this help with the bottom line? So if we kind of move that over to how this looks for production, we say, okay, if we have this system, then how do we use that system to kind of support our argument, for producing content? Like, we created the strategy and we said, okay, we need a better system, but now what? So copy and paste, anything that says copy and paste, it's not really a system. It's a process, but it's not a system. So here's a typical process. Somebody gets briefed by email. They say, can you write up blah? It's written in a word processor. It gets approved by email. Then you zip up a bunch of files. Then you store it in SharePoint because in case the auditor needs to see it. Not really an efficient system. Also, chewing gum and binder twine. I'm thinking that maybe a lot of you don't even know what binder twine is, but it's kind of like a really coarse rope. That's not a system. So I've had a client whose processes looked a little bit like this, where they had originally been a print publisher, and then they went to the web, and their taxonomy could only support 3 levels because they used to publish catalogs, and now they're online and they need 8 levels or 9 levels. So they built something on top of something else, and then it would increase the taxonomy levels, and it would collapse it, and then it would increase it, and things were broken, and people built little homemade things, and then they left, and nobody knows what it does or how it does it. And some of these went up to like 48 processes like that. And that's not really a system. It's a bunch of processes that have been kludged together, and you hope that it doesn't fall over. But it's not really an efficient system. So if you're going to do a content strategy towards getting an efficient system, you have to have a methodology. And content strategy is really based on management consulting. If you look at what management consulting has as a methodology, it's the same thing, but management consulting often focuses on financial turnarounds, and what we're doing is content turnarounds. So if I'm looking at this as a very high level, you'd say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a discovery and a gap analysis and then create a roadmap. So I'm going to assess the current state. What do we have now? What content do we have? What technology do we have? What people do we have? And what processes do we have? And then I would look at, where do I want to get to? What's my future state? Ideally, where would I want to be? And then you look at the content and how you're getting some ROI out of your content. You're looking at the technologies to support all of this, and you're looking at your processes. And then you say, okay, so what's the problem? Why can't I get to that state? And that's where you look at, what do we need to change? So you look at the gap. And it could be, we're using the wrong technology, or maybe we're using the right technology, but we're not using it well. Maybe we have some governance issues where everything would work smoothly if only the people outside of our department would sign off the content in a timely manner. There are all sorts of things that can contribute to this. And what you need to document is what changes, what is the extent of the changes, and then what are the good, better, best options. And I always say good, better, best because I don't know if you've read nudge theory, where you offer 3 products and you have something that's at $10, $12, and $20. Well, when you offer them the 10 and 12 one, they'll buy the $10 one. But if you offer them a 10, 12, and 21, now the 12 seems very reasonable and the 20 seems expensive. So you have that same situation, and where there's always one option that they're never going to pick. So you give them good, better, best. At least then you show them kind of what they can get, for what value they can get for any price point, if you will, or any system configuration. And then you create this roadmap. So you say, okay, if we want to get to this point, here's what we have to do. And this is what we have to do to the content itself. This is what we have to do in the technology. This is what we have to do in the governance. And so when you put those 3 together, now you've got, the 3 legs of the stool that will kind of prop up your implementation plan. So what I do is I base the gap analysis around this 5 pillars approach. So the 5 pillars approach really says that there are 5 areas that you need to look at if you want to do a good strategy. So you have to look at the organization, and you have to look at the users. And these needs that you're going to be looking at are 2 sides to the same coin. So if your organization wants to provide certain information, but your users don't want it, then it's a waste, because they're not going to read it, they don't want it. On the other hand, if there's something that your users want that you're not providing, that's going to become a frustration point for them as well. So you try to figure out how to match those things up. An example I sometimes use is about mobile phones. So if you say, I am going to, we want to increase sales by 10%, your consumer doesn't care. Your consumer wants to get the best price. As a matter of fact, they don't want to pay 10% more. But what the user wants is convenience. The user wants to be able to buy all the doodads that go with the phone without having to, scout around in shops and online and Amazon and eBay and so on. So you say, we will offer them these things. They will get the convenience, and now we've got a match. So this is the 2 sides of the same coin. Then I'm going to skip over content for a moment to operations, because then you have to say, what do we need operationally? So some people have called this author experience. I think author experience is definitely a big part of it, but it's bigger than that. So what do we need operationally? So we need good interfaces to software. We need good governance. We need a lot of these things for our systems to run internally and to run well. So if you think about, I'm going to save, I was going to give you an example, but I'll save that for a bit. And then you have to ask, okay, so for us to produce this content efficiently to meet these needs, what do I need to do with the content? What does the content need? So the actors aren't only the organization, the users, and the internal users. Another actor is the content itself. Does it need to be broken into chunks? Does it need to have a different kind of metadata? Does it need to be manipulated in a particular way so that it can be aggregated and pushed out and personalized, or what is it that the organization needs the content to do? And from that, then you go to the last pillar, which is the technology, because the technology needs to support the operations. Doesn't need to drive it. It needs to support it. And if you think about, content management systems, they're basically vehicles that deliver content in very fancy ways. And you think, well, in my life, I have a vehicle, and it may be a car, it may be a bicycle, but let's use a car. So I have a car, and when I'm buying the car, I automatically think to my requirements. I've got X number of children, or I have a dog, or in one case it was my parents need to be able to stand 2 recycling bins in the back. So they took the recycling bins with them when they went car shopping to see if the recycling bins would stand up in the back. So you know what your requirements are, and then you go out and you find the vehicle that fits your requirements. So it's the same thing. We just need to make sure that we have the technology piece at the end to kind of support everything else that you need to do. So when we think about what our content needs, because that's really, at the heart of all this, we need to look at the 2 sides to content. So the editorial effectiveness of the content, and then the technical effectiveness of the content. So I've put together 2 acronyms that I keep in mind when I'm wondering whether the content that I'm producing is useful. So is it relevant, accurate, informative, timely, engaging, and standards-based? And I'm talking about editorial standards here. And then on the technical side, you also have some things that you have to consider. So is it structured? As in, does it have a schema? Excuse me. Is it well formed? Is it interoperable? Can you move it between systems? So is it using a good standard? Is it predictable? Is it extensible? Is it semantically rich? And is it standards-based? And when I say standards-based, I'm not talking about the editorial side. I'm talking about the stuff that computers need to be able to process the content. So we have to think about content on both of these aspects. Now, if I'm going to take my content strategy and I'm going to map the deliverables to phases, and we kind of covered this a bit, I'm going to try to get a solid grasp of the current state. So I go back to my, my content, for example, and I say, is it rate is the acronym. So, is the content good editorially? Is it good structurally? I would do an inventory, and then from that I would do an audit, and I would do an analysis. So I would audit it, I would slice and dice, and I would look for patterns, like how many pages have high traffic, and how many pages have the proper metadata on them, and is that affecting the traffic patterns, and so on. And then I would look at the content analysis, so on-page content, and I would look at that against things like user research. I would look at personas and scenarios. And then I would try to understand the goals for the future state. So I would create some sort of a content brief to say, this is my understanding of what we need. Is this right? Let's validate. I'd look at the competitive analysis, like what are my competitors doing? I'd look at the business requirements. I'd look at the governance assessment, all these different things like for in the future. So how do we have to run this thing in the future? Because that's going to make a difference to what we do with it today. And then I would do this gap analysis. And you can look at all these different needs. And then I'd create a plan to fill the gap. So using things like a content matrix, or I might create a style guide, or do writing templates, or, so there are so many things that you could do. So these are some of the basics that I put in here. And you take those deliverables and you kind of spread them across these phases. And then you can see how a strategy can build up. So what's the goal? Well, we want to have a personalized experience. We want to have a smooth application process. This is an example. So what's the goal? This is my goal. Excuse me. And on the user side, I could say the users, they don't care if it's a personalized experience. They just know I want content that's pertinent to me. And I want to fill out my application very smoothly. And so you've got the business and the users have one tension in common, and they have one that's different. So you would say, so for operations, I want something that's efficient and scalable, and I want a tight audit trail. And maybe for the content, you'd say, I want content modules that are suited to these audience variables. So if I have different kinds of audiences and they want content that's pertinent to them, I have to chunk my content in a way that I can automatically deliver it to them. Interesting. So I'm going to need a strong taxonomy. And then on the technology side, you'd say, I need an authoring system that supports modular content production, and I need a publishing system that processes those content variants so that when people log in and I know a little bit about them, I can deliver up content that's relevant to them, whether it's a demographic difference, or it might be a product different. They have this product instead of that product. So let's move now to content ops, because we've talked about content strategy, but really the idea of a strategy is to create an operational model. So let's look at content ops. So content ops is a set of principles that results in some method that you're going to use to optimize the production of content. So usually it's around scalability. If you're coping well now, and you will be coping well in the future, you're probably not going to worry too much about content ops. But as soon as you start to scale, that's where it gets interesting, because either quality will slip or delivery will slip, and you don't want either of them to slip. So you're going to say, okay, how do we create an operational model that allows us to deliver and scale? And there's actually a community, a content ops community on Slack, and if you want to join it, feel free. It's not particularly active right now, so you're not going to get bombarded with messages, but we do discuss things like content ops in there. So the word factory says content ops is about processes and systems so that you can efficiently and effectively produce and distribute content. I see some similarities there. Processes and systems, efficiency and effectiveness. Marketing interactions. Now they talk more about marketing functions and content marketing, but again, it's about consistent quality at scale, improvement, effectiveness. And Gadgetopia talks about content operations. And again, content manipulation and analysis would be managed by a content operations process. So you see that this comes up again and again: processes, structures, scaling, optimization, and technology. So if we were to look at those kinds of, the system benefits, we can look to some of the kind of adjacent professions. Now, most of us are familiar with DevOps because a lot of us work in agile teams, and so we know what DevOps is. So DevOps has the same thing: automation, monitoring, design ops, which is a little newer. They also have, producing with minimal friction. So this is also about efficiency and effectiveness. Research ops, which is even newer. We've got reducing efficiency, scaling, repeatable processes, reliable timelines. So, this is about the same thing. Now, if we look at back in the day, where we had financial transactions, they used to do it with double entry ledger books. But now we have financial systems that automate everything. And if you want to see results, you don't have to start adding things up manually. You just look at the dashboard. So where does content ops fit into this like bigger landscape? Well, we say that it's the infrastructure and processes to create content, but it's not the same as content strategy, because it assumes you already have a plan to execute on. So this means you do the strategy, and then when you implement the strategy, you get your operational model. And back in 2014, Tom Johnson wrote about, he called it DocOps, and it was focused on documentation. And I think it's still a very valid article. It's worth reading. But the issue with that is that a lot of people said, well, I don't produce documents, I produce content. And so I think calling it DocOps was a little bit limiting. And now that we've moved to ContentOps, more people are really relating to it because they can kind of understand it in their context. So here's some real world examples. And I have to point out that the benefits can be as different as your content strategy. So it's not a cookie cutter thing. It's not to say that everybody has benefit X. Your organizations are very different, and so your results are going to be very different. So here's an example from a place called Malaspina Labs, and they had a very small team, like 3 people. They were a startup, but they knew they had to create lots of documentation because this software might go into a medical device, a hearing aid, and they wanted to make sure that from the get-go they had everything aligned so that if a company chose to license their software, that they could just provide it. So we planned for, the principles were very flexible content reuse, highly semantic content, automate the aggregation and delivery, and then they could create documents on the fly. And they actually created something like 163. It was some ridiculous number of documents, all automated, because they had everything chunked up and they knew how they had to combine the different bits to generate documentation. Here's another one from a consultancy called A, and they're more content engineers. So they use this, this content model to adhere to structural norms and so on. And what it allowed them to do was to standardize the management of their content assets. So they now use these content schemas, and it's very standard. And what it does is it speeds up the transformation and transport of content from authors to the CMS and publishing and beyond. So different benefit, but it's still an operational model because it means that we do things in a different way, and now we get the results that we want in a more efficient way. This is another example from a company called Tweddle, and it's a very interesting case study, and if you go to their site, you can read about it, where they create 2 million one-off manuals, personalized, for the Ford Mustang every year, because they have a very tight operational model. So everything is tagged up, and it's got its elements and attributes, and so they scan the VIN when a car comes off the production line, and it knows what's in the car, and it just assembles all the components, and they can send it to the printer and give you a one-off manual. So it's quite the sophisticated operation. And they even do different subsets, because they do the subset of content also that goes into the head console, and they do the subset of content that goes into the app as well. So, and it's an augmented reality app. So it's quite a sophisticated operational model. And here's another one, IBM, and they wanted to reduce the cost of their marketing content. So they built this content planning system that would just manage all of the permutations and combinations of what they needed to know about content, and they could tag it up and mark it up semantically so that they could deliver the right content during the right point in the content lifecycle. And they found that it was very helpful in at the end of the day, more people converted because they could read about the product, and it kind of helped them through their journey. So if you read the book Outside In Marketing, he talks about, James Matthewson talks about this, and it's quite fascinating. So where's the system? I have a very brief, I'm kind of conscious on the time, and I know I'm going quickly, but I've got a brief story to tell about this. So once upon a time, a consultant was introduced to the head of tech, who asked, do you have a better way for us to do content? And the consultant had an idea that would lead to lots of ROI. So they signed a contract, and the consultant went away and thought a lot, and then created a strategy which led to contracting with a tech writer for implementation. So the contractor set out to seek his fortune, and he was embedded in an agile team of developers, UXers, QA, and marketers. Now, he worked with 3 external devs who huffed and puffed and said, oh no, what you want to do, too many extra sprints to implement it. And somebody said, we can't touch the technology stack, it's impossible. And somebody else said there's no commercial value because the team thought of benefits in terms of their immediate project, which is a number of sprints. This is what we're contracted to do. If you add 3 sprints onto it, we don't see the value. And what had to happen was that, first of all, the tech writer had to be very patient. Not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 months before they would put one of his stories on the board. And even then, they kind of went, they were resistant. So the head of tech came and talked about ContentOps. And he said, look, I'm going to explain this to you very slowly. So never mind the extra sprints, because that's a very small investment for some very big gains. And it means that it's the maintenance of the content that's going to cost us the most money. And it will be so much savings for so many years to come that this project is just a drop in the bucket when it comes to cost. And it has no bearing on your technology stack, because we're not replacing anything in your technology stack. What we're replacing is Word and email and Jira tickets and all that kind of stuff. So project manager said, okay, let's go away and make some improvements. So as it happened, a week later, the regulators wanted to change the content in 14 different places. And you heard, oh, this is going to be so much work, and we have to QA in 14 places. And somebody said, well, do we actually have to do it? And they said, yes, you have to do it. Somebody goes, oh, that's an extra sprint right there. And content, it's always a contents problem. And the tech writer said, wait, I've got this covered, because we have an operational model where we create it in one place and then we push it out to those 14 places. So they reluctantly did what they were told, and the content was signed off in one place and then pushed out to those 14 places at once. And they were beyond the moon. Somebody said, oh, it saves on QA time, big time. It makes my job easier. And they said, hey, it actually saved project time because we didn't have to have a sprint just to deal with this. And of course, the developers said something like, I would have built the code differently if I'd known earlier. So, you know, if you had done it in month 1 instead of month 4, we probably would have had an even better result. And of course, there's always one person who says, I still don't like it. And somebody said, I'm in marketing and I don't want to have to learn a new tool. And we said, don't worry, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So they all set off, even if not completely comfortably, towards a coexistence where content counted too. And I use this as a cautionary tale because we see variations of this all over the place. And what we have to be able to do is show value. And in this case, it was just serendipitous that we forced their hand to put something on the board, and then when they implemented, we had that opportunity to use it right away. And you know, that's kind of the beauty of it, but you have to sometimes engineer your own proof points. So the strategy behind the ops. So the current state of that was 11 steps that were pretty manual, and copy and paste shows up at least 3 times, if not 4 times. And what we wanted to do was identify all of those wasted areas and say, how can we get rid of those? And how can we tighten the audit trail? And how can we make this more efficient? So how do you do content ops? Well, first we have to look at the history of content ops, because we started from, kind of hand typewriting, and we went to word processors like Wang and Ventura Publisher. I don't know if anyone is on the call who can remember back to the 1980s. And then FrameMaker came along, and it was like such a big deal at the time, because it allowed you to do things that you couldn't do before. And then we went to web CMSs, and then we had CCMSs. And if you have large numbers of products, you might use a product information management system or a master data management system. And now we're going to like intelligent content and information 4.0 and hybrid solutions, because things have gotten more and more complicated. And if we think about information 4.0, it's about this kind of ubiquitous delivery of content and on-demand content. So if you talk to your connected car and you say, could you check the tire pressure in the front right tire? And your voice command goes somewhere, and they interpret it, and it sends a command down to the sensor, and it senses it, and it sends a command back, and it figures out the content state, the state of the tire pressure, and then the content that's related to that, and then it would either give you back a voice command or an icon or a line of text saying, your tire pressure is fine, keep driving, or whatever it may be. So when we think about back in the days of Wang, it was way not as complex as it is now. So if you're thinking about doing content operations, you start with a content strategy, so your requirements, gap analysis, and roadmap, and then you implement, so you assess, you install whatever you've chosen, and then you configure it, and then operationalize. So you need training, you need use, and you need iterations. And so you have to plan for that as well. So it's like, when you build a house, you have to plan for maintenance of the house. You can't just build the house and then assume that nothing will ever break down. So content strategy and content ops have long been part of TechComm, because TechComm has always been the department that gets squeezed. And when you have to produce content at scale, then you understand that you just need to work smarter and not harder. So I talked to my friend Christy Taylor, and I said, if you're looking at content ops, what do you need? And she's like, I want a repeatable system. I want it to be automated as much as possible. I don't want writers to be slow computers. I want them to be doing high-value tasks, not managing a spreadsheet. I want translations built in. I want scalability. And if we buy another company or need to integrate content between departments, I want this to be an infrastructure that's ready for doing that. Whoops. And so it's not just the toolkit, but how you use them. So what she wants is semantic content structures and power authoring and components and transclusions and workflow management and all these things to be able to deliver to downstream systems. So she wants like a good, robust toolkit so that she can operate, into the future. She wants to future-proof her content so that she gets the smooth operations. So on the Marcom side, they have those demands as well, because things are getting more complex now. So I worked with this woman who's the delivery manager at a council or municipality, we would call it here. And she said she wants this service design approach, and she wants flexibility to kind of show content on multiple places of the website wherever it's needed. She doesn't want to have to link people to places and take them out of their journey. She wants to automate, and also she wants her writers to use their expertise on the highest value tasks, and she wants scalability. So she has a slightly different need, but it also comes down to semantic structures and something that's easy to use and supports the workforce and so on. So slightly different, but a lot of them have this commonality. So it's about getting into a situation where you need to scale up and you need that support. You need to be able to do it not on an ad hoc, one-off basis, but across the whole corpus. And for technical communicators, this means opportunity. Now, if you read about organizational silos. Silos will probably always exist. You can't expect Marcom and techcomm or Marcom and social or whoever it is to start doing each other's work. But Shel Holtz in, I think this is in Harvard Business Review, he said, don't try containment, try ventilation. So ventilate the silos, get a lot of cross communication going. And so one of the things that I can think of right away is that Marcom isn't really interested in learning, for example, an XML editor, how to use an XML editor, but they could really benefit from it. So techcomm can be the experts in the production and delivery of content. And you can find those reciprocal areas where you can help each other out to the mutual benefit. So there's nothing about silos that inherently inhibits interaction with people in other silos. And if you think about an emergency team, this is how they work. They're focused on the patient. And so they don't say like, this isn't my job, or I'm in that silo, or you come in afterwards, or, they work together to keep the patient alive. And so if you think about your organization as the patient, or by extension, your end users, then you're thinking about how do we make this happen? And it's not so like we do this content and they do that content. It's like, okay, you do more of this and we'll do more of that, and we'll find ways to collaborate. So we want to ventilate those silos. So you want to raise the bar on your expertise. And so to do that, it means that you want to climb the content maturity ladder. So a lot of organizations are somewhere down around level 2. Sometimes they're level 1, and usually they want to get up to about level 4. And so you want to kind of walk them up that maturity level, because that will allow you to get to a point where you can operate. You can have a content ops model that is really functional. You'll never have it when you're at level 1, where it's like this create and fling, and there's just kind of, the chaos of the startup is a good example there. You want to have content that's treated as a corporate asset, where you've got processes to support that. So it means, and I've said this a few times, working harder instead of smarter. So content delivery is the cheapest part. Once it's in the CMS and you just have to pump it out, very low cost. The content creation is more costly. You have highly trained writers, and it's going to cost you to create content. But content maintenance is a way higher cost, because not only are you doing everything you would do during content creation, but you're doing all these other things like finding it and checking it and looking for all the variants and searching the CMS for things that may have gotten lost. So when you think about how you're going to scale, look at your content maintenance costs. So next step on your content journeys, I've given you a few things where you can go and learn about it, and some conferences that you might want to consider. And you can go out and kind of find your path. There's not really any place that's teaching this, so you have to kind of do some self-directed learning. But there is lots out there if you are motivated to go and do that. So final thoughts. What would content strategy and content ops look like in your organization? What would you do with all that freed up brain power? And what would it take to make content happen in your organization? And that concludes my presentation. And we have a few minutes now to take questions. So does anyone have questions? I don't know if I have, the questions. Got the questions panel here. No questions? I am shocked. Somebody has a, thank you. Well, it's always a pleasure to be here. Where can you get the slides? I think STC is going to make them available to you. There's going to be a link that happens within a short period of time, I think within a week. Oh, the difference between content strategy and knowledge management, that's an interesting one. So content strategy is a plan to deliver, whereas knowledge management is more like sharing knowledge and sharing information. So knowledge management would be, for example, this is just one example, but on your intranet, where people start to collaborate on maybe there's documents or policies, and then you can kind of collaborate on them, and then you can familiarize yourself more and so on. So that's kind of the very short and rough answer of it. How do I articulate these ideas to a client who is asking for a content strategy? And how do you ascertain what the client needs? Well, you can use the methodology that I presented. So if they're asking for a content strategy, you're already 3/4 of the way there, because the tough clients are the ones who don't realize they need a strategy. They just want to do stuff. So if they ask you for a content strategy, then you can say, you can ask them, what do you want to get out of this? What are your pain points? And you start to do the discovery. And once you discover what the pain points are, then you do the gap analysis. So starting by what they want to get out of it, because usually there's a problem. There's some sort of a problem they want to solve, and they're looking to you to solve it with your expertise. And sometimes they don't even know quite what the problem is. So I had one client that said, we need to be able to use Word better to deliver these 29 versions of this huge document set. And my answer was, I don't think you really just want to use Microsoft Word better. I think what you need to do is put stuff into a different system. And I said, let me come back with a presentation for you. And I showed them some of the alternatives, and they were blown away by it, because a lot of places don't even know that the tools that we use exist, for example. And so they'll never ask for it. I always say that if you ask someone how I'm going to get from here to there, and they don't know an airplane exists, they're going to describe a boat, and they'll describe all sorts of boats, but they'll never describe an airplane if they don't know that air travel exists. And so as the strategist, you know what exists. And so you are in a better position to say whether they need a boat or to fly on a plane, for example. So examples of content systems. So ServiceNow or Inquira or Documented in SharePoint. Well, there are so many systems out there, and it depends what you're trying to do with them. And it depends on how many components of a system you want to string together. So if you're doing an intranet, you might say, I want SharePoint and an intranet in a box that goes over top of SharePoint. And that might be good. But you need to match it to the needs. So even giving you the names of systems really wouldn't be useful. So, for example, in techcomm, there are a lot of systems that use the DITA XML standard, because it's the best standard that's out there right now for modular content. So which systems use DITA? Well, there are all sorts of systems use DITA, but they might not all work for you. So I think a lot of what you need to do is just be aware, go to conferences, talk to vendors, find out what things do, stay current. It comes down to that. I wish I could give you kind of more, like to go into it more, but it's probably not in a forum like this. We might need to do something on kind of the current state of content systems. But that would be interesting. I would go to it. So slides, would I be able to share a content strategy plan? Okay, or an operational model. Yes, you can go to actually the Content Strategy Alliance. See, I think it's called contentstrategyalliance.org. It's in one of my slides, the second to last slide, I think. And a lot of practitioners have shared their deliverables. So you've got probably 30, 40 of them there. So you can see everything from a requirements matrix to a content brief to an inventory and audit, anything you could think of. So yeah, just go and have a look because you'll find something in there that's for you, I'm sure. Yeah, Nikki says I should add STC Summit to my list of conferences. Yeah, I think I need a new passport before they'll let me into the US because I've been to a couple of countries that they don't really like. So we might have to wait a bit before I'm allowed to travel in the US. Although this fall I am hoping to be able to get to the Information Development World Conference. So we'll see. How did I become CKO? Oh, that's a whole other story. I won't go into it now, but let's say I kind of fell into it because I had been consulting for many, many years. And so they said, you know, we're going to make you CKO because what you're doing for us matches that. So I do a lot of kind of business development and thought leadership and so on. Amazing. Do you consult with organizations? Yes, I did that independently for 15 years, and then I moved to the UK and started working for a company, but I do it through the company now. So yes, I do consult with organizations. A lot of content strategists have gone in-house lately, so there aren't as many freelancers out there anymore, which I find a little bit disturbing because, you know, if you don't have that expertise in-house, how are you going to get it unless you hire a consultant? So somewhere I'm hoping that there are lots of consultants in training out there. Suggestion for getting on board with developing a content strategy when they're not interested in how things happen. This is a good question. So how do you get management on board when they're not interested in how things happen? I think you have to show them the benefits. So the benefit could be anything from, you know, if we don't change how we produce stuff, we could get sued. And one woman actually had told me we produce, I think it was golf carts. And so once a year, somebody drives the golf cart like over the edge of a cliff into a river or something. And then, of course, the lawsuits start. And she said, because we have such a tight control on our documentation, we always win the lawsuit. So it's usually 75% against the golf course and 25% against the manufacturer. And so we can always like trot out our stuff and show that we weren't at fault. And so it's, you know, we save the company $1 million a quarter right there on lawsuits. So when they see those kinds of things, they don't have to know about the mechanics. That's too low level. They just need to know what are they going to get. Another health and safety project that I did, they were fined $1 million because they couldn't prove that they had given training to people and like 2 people died in an industrial accident. And they said, we did give them training. And they said, prove it. And they had to like bring back boxes from, you know, Blue Mountain Storage and look through signatures and say, is that Bob's? Is that Bob's handwriting? And they couldn't prove it. And so they had a year to prove it. And that led to this, this need to do their documentation in a way that was going to fulfill the auditor's requirements. So there's always some business reason that they're interested in. And if you can show some monetary benefit at the end, or customer satisfaction, or market position, you know, it's very convincing. Is content strategy part of user experience? Oh, you bet. I would say that user experience, it's kind of a toss-up whether content is part of user experience or user experience is part of content, because in the end, for a lot of organizations, content is the front door. So if you can't produce content to tell your story or talk about your product or whatever, then the rest of the user experience falls flat. So if you think about, like, if you went to Amazon and it was really very pretty, except there was no content, no price, no image, you know, then what use would the site be to you? It wouldn't. You know, content is the big thing. Thank you, Kathy, for that endorsement. I love it. Content management systems. Well, again, it's, oh God, goodness, there's so many of them. And it's not even about content management systems, it's about authoring environments. So an authoring environment should be in front of the content management system, and it should feed the content management system. So whether you're looking at, let me think about, you know, whether you're using FrameMaker or RoboHelp or Flare or Gather Content or Dida2 or any of those authoring systems, those are the things where you're going to get your bang for your buck. What are the tools I found useful to implement a content strategy? Mostly I live in Excel spreadsheets, ironically. Nobody has built a content strategy tool yet that kind of gets us out of that, but I live in Google Analytics maybe 30% of the time, and Excel spreadsheets the other 70% of the time, always slicing and dicing content to, you know, to do analyses of some sort. So I think I've raced through all of the questions, and we're a few minutes over, but I'm hoping everyone found it useful. So if you have any other questions, feel free to ping me, and you know, the STC will make this stuff available. I'm going to be publishing something next week about the 5 pillars approach, and the week after that we're going to have a panel discussion with the grandmother of content strategy, who is Anne Rockley, and you know, who came from a techcomm background as well, and Marie Girard-Chopinet, who used to work for IBM in France, so she's also very good at articulating content strategy in the context of techcomm. And last but not least, Jeffrey McIntyre, who doesn't come from a techcomm background, but is who really gets content in our context, and has made the bridge between the silos in that way that we talked about. So I'm hoping you can join us for some of those. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rahel, and thank you all for joining today's webinar. You will be receiving an email with a link to the evaluation and the recording of the webinar today. So thank you all again, and have a great day.